And I'm really honored to have this chance at University Kebangsaan, Malaysia, and for the first time, I was just overwhelmed by the elegance and the incredible ambiance. I've never been exposed. This is almost like addressing the British Parliament. This is a real honor. And I also believe, with only very passionate discussions with distinguished colleagues, that dialogue among civilizations actually, in practice, feature very prominently in the overall design of the program, both in teaching and research at the university. But let me also express my appreciation to Dr. Lan Kim Chung for his sponsorship. Indeed, as a beneficiary of the Morning Sun Charity Fund, I salute his commitment to the life of the mind for continued support to various kinds of scholarly endeavors, not just at Harvard, but at Peking University, at many other universities as well. And I particularly would like to recognize Desmond Beer, his representative here. Ezra Vogel instructed me, both a friend and also a teacher, that I should not give a very serious and therefore boring academic presentation. And he also made it very clear he wanted me to share ideas, or my ideas, hopefully personal ideas, that are thought-provoking and personally gratifying. In other words, he wanted me to speak freely and even extemporaneously. That's the reason there are no PowerPoints and no real totally prepared notes and no text. And this is not necessarily dialogical because I now have to carry on a monologue for a while. But the real purpose of this gathering, I hope, is the exchange afterwards. I just offer some of my rather tentative and still evolving ideas. I need to deal with the question, what does it mean by dialogue? Everybody seems to know it. We are engaged in dialogue on a daily basis. But in this particular context, what does it mean? Of course, from a scholarly point of view, the most famous way of using this dialogue is the Socratic dialogue. And the way that the great Greek master used it as a pedagogy for instructing young students about truth, about beauty, about reality. But this is not the dialogue I have in mind. In fact, I wouldn't say that my approach is not Socratic, but in a way it is very different from the Socratic dialogue. For the simple reason that in the Socrates perception of the dialogue, the teacher knows the truth, knows at least a higher level of understanding the truth, and the student is ignorant. So it's the teacher's responsibility of trying to shape the mind of the student by asking challenging questions. The students will have to respond and gradually help the student to evolve. And of course, the classical example I can think about in Greek philosophy is the Platonic cave. The idea that all of us philosophically unsophisticated or not educated in philosophy are actually in the cave, facing the wall, maybe chained. So we have no real vision of what happens outside of the cave. And the philosopher, of course, in the Greek sense, the philosopher king, hopefully, will have a chance of leading us out of the cave to look at the world beyond. Without this guidance from the philosopher, we'll never be able to see it. So the Socratic method is to try to help an ignorant student to become gradually enlightened. This is not what I have in mind. The Confucian idea is very different. It is in the analects. The difference is it is two-way traffic. It is never one way. It's not one master that leads the students out. It is a reciprocal. It is mutually beneficial. The teacher seems to know more because he's more experienced. But unless he's also a student, he cannot teach. And the student is not only a challenger, the student can also turn out to be an educator. So it's a joint enterprise. The teacher and student, of course, remain asymmetrical in terms of age, experience, knowledge, and so forth. But in the dialogical mode, as Alex presented, it is a joint enterprise. And the assumption is that each and every human being is perfectible, is improvable through self-cultivation. So the teacher may help the student to understand his or her own inner voice, inner light, but the teacher doesn't have the monopoly over truth. It's a gradual process. And the kind of dialogue I have in mind is also very different from dialectics. Many people are very much fascinated by dialectical mode of thinking, especially in China. But the dialectic mode is, there's some kind of built-in aggressiveness. There's the thesis, the antithesis, the synthesis. So the thesis has been challenged, and then the successful challenger will try to reach a higher level of understanding that at a higher level, both thesis and antithesis are overcome. That kind of intellectual exercise is very important for education, especially in modern times. Most universities, East and West, exercise that particular mode of thinking. But what I have in mind here is not aggressiveness. It's mutual respect, mutual learning. So this dialogue is very much of an interactive one. Why this kind of dialogue is important in our time? Let's say we all know that globalization, especially economic globalization, has become a very powerful force of homogenization in trade, in finance, in tourism, even in disease and crime. All these are international or global. And the world seems to be shaped by one kind of force, maybe the market economy, that eventually all the differences will be overcome or will be relegated to the background. This is our general conception about globalization in economic terms. But we know that cultural globalization, as Peter Berg and others have studied, is a process of sometimes enhancing localizations and indigenizations. In other words, cultural globalization is not a process of homogenization, but a process that underscores difference. Diversity becomes obvious. The more global, the more local, and therefore the awkward term global, which means the continuous interaction of two seemingly contradictory and yet sometimes complementary forces, globalizing force and localizing force. So the world becomes more and more complex. This reminds me that globalization is fundamentally different from the modernization and westernization. Westernization was a geographic idea, something that happened in one particular geographic unit in a specific time that became more and more powerful. Modernization, which started probably in the late 50s, at Harvard in particular, with scholars such as Paco Parsons and so forth, they believe that the geographic notion or the spatial notion is not good enough. So change it to a temporal notion about modernization in different stages of development. So from westernization to modernization used to allow us to understand the process that originated in the West, so-called Enlightenment, in the 17th and 18th century became much broader. And in other words, it would define human history as a unilinear progression towards the modern world. But globalization is complex. It is both regional, spatial, and also chemical. And yet, globalization, unlike modernization, is not simply homogenization. Therefore, many of the forces in human history, they were considered somewhat outdated or relegated backward by the advent of the modernizing process, resurfaced as important forces, both in positive and negative sense, in shaping our world in the 21st century. If we follow, right now we know, a rather single-minded notion about human progress as unilinear progression from religion to metaphysics to science, from superstition to speculation to to understanding reality based on empirical methods. Then the assumption is that in the 20th century, religion would be relegated to the background, maybe not very powerful, useful, and philosophy would be too much of a luxury. But in the 21st century, we realized that two of the perhaps major, two of the most important forces in shaping our world turn out to be religion, identity politics. And these are related to what I call primordial times. Those forces that shape us into concrete human beings. These forces often are understood, I think, incorrectly as constraints, as limitations, such as ethnicity, or race, gender, language, the place of birth, the linguistic universe, the specific social strata that we come from, and of course our basic faith community. These are often considered forces that divide the world into many different parts. So if we, in the modernizing process, in the earlier westernizing process, the idea is that we will be able to overcome all these differences. Then, using the old American idea in the melting pot, we'll be all the same. But it's not happening. What actually happened is that all these primordial forces turn out to be very, very important in the 21st century. Part of the reason is because the modernizing process, now the globalizing process, leads to the liberation of the human persons in choosing, selecting, and reacting to the environment in a way that's never been thought before as possible. And this ability to choose, the liberated individual to choose, actually enhances every person's concrete situation. I become even more aware of my ethnic, linguistic, social, political, religious background, precisely because we encounter a much more complicated world. And that's true as a universal situation. This is sharply contrasted with the pre-modern period, when different religious, linguistic, ethnic communities roughly sufficient in their own modus operandi, not at all interacting with many other different communities and societies. For example, the Christians probably interact mostly among Christians, the Buddhists among Buddhists, and the Confucians among Confucians. A very revealing example was given to me by Mr. Dr. Lucas, who served as the Prime Minister of the Netherlands for 12 years, one of the great public intellectuals in the world. And he grew up in Holland, in the Catholic community. As you know, Holland is basically Protestant. And he said, at age of 17, for the first time in my life, I met someone who's not a Catholic. He met a fellow student of his who was a Protestant. He was astonished. There's another kind of Christianity. So that example, experience, he's now only in his 80s. So I think a few decades ago, this phenomena is possible. Right now, it's beyond belief. No matter where you are, the possibility of you interacting only with people of your own linguistic, religious, and ethnic background is no longer possible. Sometimes probably through virtual reality, but in any way, face-to-face communication as well. The world is much more complicated. And with this kind of complexity of the challenge of diversity, then dialogue has assumed a particular significance, a particular meaning. And of course, many people just believe that dialogue as a way of human interaction is very idealistic. That's not true at all. We are involved in a dialogical mode every day.